Hastings, a town where the number of private rented homes has mushroomed over the last decade, reflecting a national and regional trend. In some parts of the town, private lets now account for more than half of all households. The council says with that comes rogue landlords and antisocial behaviour, so it's taking steps to improve standards for tenants by proposing a scheme to licence privately rented homes.
It'll mean we can be more proactive in improving the quality and the standards of accommodation. We can assist landlords in dealing with any antisocial behaviour that takes place within the property, and we can make sure that properties are better managed. Many of our landlords may not live in the town, not all of them take as much interest in their property as they should, and this is a way to get better managed, better run, better quality properties.
The council says 49% of privately rented accommodation in Hastings fail to meet government standards for decent homes. The new so-called selective licence would apply to the majority of Hastings' 12,000 homes in the private rented sector, at a cost of £415 per property over the 5-year scheme. Landlords would have to prove that their properties are safe and well maintained. Those that don't comply could face a £20,000 fine. There were around 5,000 complaints about antisocial behaviour in Hastings in 2013. But will this new licence help to put an end to it? As part of their consultation, the council mapped out police reports of antisocial behaviour and found a link in some areas where private landlords were failing to do their bit to curb the problem. But last year, only 3 landlords in Hastings were prosecuted by the authority.
The idea of selective licensing is to be just that, selective. So you might do it by street, you might do it by landlord, you might even do it potentially by ward. But in this scale, Hastings Borough Council are proposing to do it town-wide. And I think that's not selective licensing, that's blanket licensing. And what would worry me is that those costs will clearly be passed over to the tenants and it'll end up just being a tenant's tax. And that is a mistake, because then we'll see more people homeless.
This landlady in Gravesend has some 10 properties.
Hello, Mrs. King.
She's also a consultant to the local authority, which considered selective licensing last year. But Gravesham threw it out in favour of a voluntary code of standards.
They understand that actually working with landlords, working together, they're going to get a lot more positive result from it. They're finding that actually a little bit of we'll help you landlords, and in return we want to see you raising your standards in the private rented sector. And the limited resources Grovesham have with the enforcement officers, they're now being freed up to actually go and do what their job is and go and knock on the doors of properties that maybe don't meet the standard.
So far, nationwide, around 25 Labour-controlled authorities currently use selective licensing, including nearby Thanet. Others are still considering the scheme. We won't know if Hastings will join that list until later this year. But will this measure really make an impact?
Joining us now from Dover is Will Scobie. Will standing for Labour in the constituency of South Thanet at the general election. Thanet Council introduced this system of selective licensing back in 2011. Will Scobie, nice to have you with us. According to Shelter, the area that's selected must be an area of either low housing demand or be suffering significant problems with antisocial behaviour. What were the problems that led you to introduce selective licensing in the Thanet area?
I mean, we've always had huge problems for about 20 or 30 years now in Cliftonville and Margate. It's a lot of the old Georgian and Victorian houses that were guest hotels were turned into bedsits and one-bedroom flats, and that's caused a huge amount of problems with antisocial behaviour and crime. And the council brought this in with another package of measures to actually try and improve things, and it's been incredibly successful. We've had several high-profile prosecutions where landlords that for years and years have not been looking after their properties have been taken to court and fined for that. And also there's been a general improvement across the board in housing. It's been a really successful scheme, and I'm really hoping that Hastings will bring theirs in to actually improve their area as well. OK,
let's take a look at the figures for antisocial behaviour since you brought it in. In Margate Central, the average antisocial incidents per month were 99 back in 2011. They're 95 now, 4 years on since you brought this in. That's really not statistically significant.
Well,
so it's hard to argue that this has made any difference.
Well,
here,
we have quarterly meetings with the police. I was at a meeting just on Tuesday this week, and they said that antisocial behaviour in the town centre wards had gone down by 10%, so it's still coming down.
It's come down by about 10% in Cliftonville West, but much less than that in Margate Central. What sort of antisocial behaviour are you talking about here? What sort of behaviour can you solve with a licensing system?
Well, the licensing scheme itself is hope it is improving the safety concerns that a lot of people have, and that does include things like gas safety certificates, smoke alarms, all those sorts of things.
In what way is that connected to antisocial behaviour? I'm sorry, I'm struggling to see the connection.
Well, if you're actually regulating the landlords and actually improving the safety side of it, that's one side, obviously. There's a whole other section to do with how the landlords themselves are treating their tenants. So one of the big problems we do actually have is disagreements between the tenants and the landlords, people not actually having proper contracts. For example, in Cliftonville West, the average tenancy is 6 months. And what that means is that people don't put down roots in the area. They're there for such a short time, so they don't treat the area properly. The Thanet Council took a very brave decision to go ahead with this policy and should get credit for it because it's actually improving things. I've lived in Cliftonville my entire life, and it's the first time in 25 years that we're actually starting to see people putting money back into the area and things improving.
It's working perhaps because it's very focused, even specific streets in some cases. But in Hastings, they're talking about what amounts to the whole town, and I wonder if you can see any downsides to licensing across such a wide area.
My personal feelings is that actually the licensing scheme does need to be extended within Thanet, because the only problem you have with doing it in a specific area is you sometimes move the problem around.
Well, here's a final thought then. Should every landlord in the country be licensed?
I think that we should certainly look at that. I mean, the point is, and I was listening on your piece just before about some landlords and saying what happened in Gravesham. The point is, most landlords look after their properties and do a very good job, and they're being let down by a very small group who are either absentee, not looking after their properties, and that's the group that we need to target, absolutely. But there's no scheme so far that's managed to actually do that, and this is working.
Will Scobie, councillor and prospective parliamentary candidate for South Thanet, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Tim Norton, Will Scobie there says licensing is working and it should be extended. Now, to our knowledge, not a single Conservative council has used these powers. Why not?
Well, I think the clue is in the title. As Amber said in that piece, it's selective licensing. I'm in favour of it in principle, but it's to be used selectively. But
the Conservatives haven't selectively used it anywhere.
No, but they can if they choose to. But what we're now looking at is town-wide, borough-wide, and what's being used, frankly, as a tenant tax in Hastings. So they're looking to do it in 10 wards at over 400 quid a pop. That brings in a nice little earn of over 4 million quid. And who's going to pay that?
Well, it's supposed to be cost neutral, and even if it does cost the tenant something, well, have a look at the costs. If you break it down, £415 over 5 years. In Hastings, it'll cost each landlord £1.60 a week. It's not a seriously large sum of money, is it?
But it's not going to cost the landlord, is it? Because those costs are going to be passed on to the tenant. And what you didn't have in your piece, it would be interesting to have seen in Thanet the effect on the rents in those areas as well. Because ultimately, it is the tenants who will pay. We need to make sure, and we've got a lot of measures to make sure we don't have unscrupulous landlords, to make sure they are not dumping antisocial tenants and then taking the money and running, to make sure they're not living in substandard flats. We have measures to do that. Where there are extreme measures that need to be taken, that's where you get selective licensing, but not to be used across the whole borough and town as they now are.
Well, let's pick up on that selective issue first of all, Sarah. In Hastings, it isn't selective, is it? I mean, it is town-wide. You can't really argue that that is what the original legislation in 2004 provided
I think, as you saw in your clip there, Hastings is a particular area where we have more than double the average numbers of renters in the country, really. It's double the national average. So we have a particularly acute problem there. And the legislation exists to tackle this problem. I don't see why more councils aren't using it, to be honest. But £415 for 5 years actually is cheaper than car insurance.
Okay.
It really isn't a huge amount.
Okay.
And we're not asking landlords to jump through particular hoops that they shouldn't be doing already.
Right. Well, in which case, if they should be jumping through them already, why do you now need another?
We've got 9 million renters in the UK.
Yeah.
3 million of those people live in below par accommodation. What's the answer? Do you just carry on doing nothing because the current system is failing people who are renting?
Okay, so you're making a reasonable argument about how it could improve the standards of accommodation, but in many cases, people are making argument, and Will Scobie tried to make one there, about decreasing antisocial behaviour. He wasn't compelling on that one, was he?
I think it's more about the areas and the types of standards of accommodation that you live in.
Right.
We've had a particularly successful scheme called Grotbusters in Hastings, where landlords were forced and property owners were forced to do up the fronts of their property, and it has changed the environment of where people live. And I think bringing up standards of not just the outside of properties but the inside of properties as well, it brings pride to the area and a sense of community, and does mean that people will stay longer. And a lot of these
they're doing other things as well. It's not just this. And this is what the legislation says you should do, and what Shelter says.
Frankly, there's a degree of stigma here. I mean, Sarah, I'm rather alarmed, is talking down the town of Hastings to say that we appear to have a rather large instance of antisocial behaviour and rubbish property. Well, if I lived in Hastings, I would be pretty offended by that.
Tack to go down. We've got a real problem. 1 in 10 properties suffer with cold, damp and mould, and they are rented properties. But what are you going to do about it? You've offered nothing about. You've offered nothing.
The existing legislation.
We are using the existing legislation. We're not doing something that's outside of the law.
Saying you need to bring in a selective scheme.
But this isn't outside of. But this isn't outside of existing legislation. This is within the existing law, and this is localism, which is precisely what you wanted.
Why not just admit that you are using this to raise over £4 million?
I think that's unlikely. Tim, we've got to squeeze in a few other stories. Thank you. They should put you two on the telly. You're fantastic together. It's time now for a roundup of the